In today's video, we're going to be finding out what's wrong with that Ram 1500 Ecodiesel. Let's get into it. Alright, welcome back to the channel, you guys. So, as mentioned, we're going to figure out what is hopefully going on with this Ram 1500 Ecodiesel. I don't know if we'll fully solve the issue or the problem with it today, but we're going to at least start getting into it and see what we can figure out. So, just for starters, I guess I'll go ahead and I'll show you guys the issue with it. I guess a few things. We bought this truck with some issues, some engine issues. It shows low oil pressure, and not only that, but the battery does appear to keep dying. So I think it needs a new battery. So it won't even start right now. I have it on a trickle charger, so it might start now after having it charging for a little bit. But what I am probably going to do is just swap out the battery that I have in my other Ram, at least so we can rule that out as a factor. I also did point out in the last video that I can see a little bit of coolant right there dripping from it. So I do want to find out where that's coming from. I'm going to yank the battery out of the SRT10 first, and this thing doesn't really go anywhere, and it has a brand new battery in it so that I can rule out any factors. So we'll pull the battery out of here, we'll throw it in the truck so that we rule out any potential electrical gremlins due to a bad battery. You never know with these newer trucks with all the electronics. So we'll start with the simplest thing. The battery seems to be faulty in it, so we'll grab this one and toss it in. Well, I was gonna swap it, but the terminals are on the wrong side. See how here, positive's here? Well, if we turn it around, this is the original battery. We've got the negative on this side, so I actually probably need to go get a battery, but just for now, let me put some jumper cables from this to the truck and see if it starts. All right, let's test it out, because I've had this battery on trickle charge twice now, and it's already died on us both times. So I don't want to go buy a battery because it's actually more expensive since it's for a diesel. But we'll try it on here with the jumper cables, and then we'll try it with the battery from the SRT10, see if we get any different results. I did have the trickle charger on this for a little bit, but let's see. No, nothing. Not even an attempt to start. Let's see what we get with the other battery. All right, let's try again. No, still no bueno. Oh, I wish I could test it first before I go invest in a battery. All right, well for now, I'm just gonna throw the old battery back in since I got it to start with that last time. It's been on trickle charger for a little bit. Worst comes to worst, I'll connect this battery with the jumpers, and that should be enough to at least get started for now. Okay, and here we go. It's not enough juice. So watch, let's connect the other battery, and then that'll for sure tell us whether that battery's toast. All right, we've got that battery connected to this battery. Let's see what we got. And here we go. Almost. All right, well, I am gonna go get a battery, so let's go get a battery. Now we're in the daily driven Viper until we get that truck running. We definitely need to get this thing running. There we go, we just left Walmart, we got our battery, we've got our pickup truck, so let's get back. And just like that, we're back. So let's get the battery out of the truck and get it into that truck. New battery is in, and just side note, you guys, usually in SoCal, batteries don't last that long because of the heat. They usually last about 4 or 5 years. So since it says Chrysler on it, probably the original battery from 2016, so it's about due anyways. And now let's go ahead and start this thing. So now she should fire right up. There we go. That's more like it. So that's what she sounds like, you guys. It's a pretty quiet diesel engine. So I'm gonna let it warm up, and I don't know, maybe it might be as strange as just an electrical issue from that battery being so dead, but we'll let it get up to temperature, and then if it acts up, it's gonna act up then. So I'll show you guys what's going on here. So obviously it says that the filter needs to be cleaned out, but here's the oil pressure. So see how it says 31 PSI? it will, from what all the research I've done, at idle, hot or warm is usually, you know, between 19 and like, you know, 22 psi. So it'll sit around there, but what happens is once it gets up to temperature, it'll sit around like 19 psi, and then all of a sudden that gauge, this is an oil pressure gauge, it'll just slam dunk all the way to 0, and then it'll come flying back to 19 psi. So I've seen other guys where they had catastrophic issues after purchasing this. I really started digging into it, and theirs would read like 9 psi. And the weird part about this truck is it doesn't have an actual oil pressure sensor. I know it sounds weird, but the oil pressure is actually a calculation between it has an oil temperature sensor, so it's a calculation between the oil temperature sensor and I believe coolant temperature. So it's just a mathematical calculation actually that's giving us our oil pressure. And then there's a second thing, which is an oil pressure switch. So while this warms up, you can see we're at 29 psi. We'll let it do its thing. I'll go show you what I'm talking about. So what this is, you guys, is the pretty much oil filter assembly and whatnot from the Ecodiesel. Yes, it's used. No, it's not off that truck because that truck's running right now. I bought this off of eBay, as you can see. Somebody was selling it. I got it for $65, including shipping for the whole assembly, because I've heard that a few different things can go wrong. So like I mentioned, there's 2 sensors on this, and if you guys search up Ecodiesel, you'll find stuff like this. So this one here, the one with 2 pins, this is an oil temperature sensor. This one here with the single pin, this is an oil pressure switch. So all it does is if it sees low oil pressure, it will just trigger this one wire, and an indication will come up on your dash, and it'll try to shut the engine down to protect it. So like I said, it doesn't actually have an oil pressure sensor. It's got an oil temperature sensor and an oil pressure switch. So I believe, my hunch and hope is that it's just this sensor. I figured, I bought this whole assembly. It's got the cooler, it's got the whole adapter, and it's got both sensors. So I figured I could try a few different things. And the other thing too, from what I've researched on the forums, see that little plastic thing right here? Apparently this can mess up and affect your oil pressure. So worst comes to worst, I've got the whole unit. But first things first is we'll let it get up to temperature, see if it's still acting up with that new battery. And if it's not, or if it is, then we're gonna try that oil pressure sensor. I only wanna do one thing at a time, just so we can narrow it down as to what the actual repair or what the fix is for this thing, if it ends up being, you know, something as simple as this. I don't really know how this engine's supposed to sound. I don't know if you guys can hear it in the background. It doesn't sound all that bad. It doesn't sound like any crazy rod knock or anything. It just sounds like a little diesel to me, but we'll see. We'll let it warm up. I'll see if it's still throwing that error, and then if it is, we'll try throwing that sensor on there, or the switch, sorry, oil pressure switch. I have to be careful with my words there. So here we go. Coolant temperature is at 111 and our oil pressure is at 26 psi. So still within the normal range. So like I said, once it warms up, I'll show you guys. Probably gonna still act up, but we'll wait for it to get up to temp. All right, so we're at 141 Fahrenheit for engine temperature or coolant temperature. And we're now at 21 psi, which is still perfectly fine, but this is what I meant. Is once it starts to get into this normal range, if it hits about 19 psi, you'll just see this do full sweep back. And I just read a comment from the previous video showing you guys the actual truck itself, and somebody else also mentioned that the oil pressure switch is known to go bad as well. So fingers crossed, boys, we'll see. But even as I hold the RPM, like, it doesn't sound terrible. So I'm just trying to build a little bit of heat in this motor since it's taken forever, but you can see there, maybe 1400 RPM. We're sitting at 39 PSI, so definitely good oil pressure everywhere else. We're almost at 150 degrees for coolant temp. All right, guys, so I just did see it act up. So see, our gauge is in the middle there, and watch, see how we're sitting at 20 PSI? It'll sit here and just drop for no reason all the way to nothing, and you'll see the indication come up on the dash here, watch. There you go, see it? See how it's acting sporadic though? Like, the pump isn't an issue, it's just, it seems more electrical. So see how we're perfectly fine? Look, drops down to nothing, flies all the way back up to normal oil pressure. So there you guys go. So we still have the issue even though we changed the battery, so I'm gonna turn this thing off and we'll change that sensor out because we might as well since it's still doing it. So like I mentioned, this is what goes on the block. So it sits like this on the driver's side. So essentially we need a socket to go around this top one because that's the oil pressure switch. So we're gonna swap that one out. So I'll find out what socket it is and then we'll see how fast we can swap that out. All right guys, so exact same as what I just showed you. Here is the housing for the oil filter. And then just below it, if I sneak you guys in here, you can see the sensors are both right there. So that's what we're getting to. So I'm gonna put a rag down, I'm gonna disconnect that clip, and we'll try it out. And I'm just gonna crack it loose, which really wasn't hard at all. I'm gonna get my new sensor ready right next to it so that I can do as fast of a swap as possible, you guys. And here we go. There we go, she's plugged in. Let's go fire it back up. All right guys, so we're gonna go ahead and start it. Which that one's really weird. We're not showing any oil pressure at all now for some reason. Unless there's something faulty with the wiring. That does not make any sense. Okay guys, it is the next day and I wanted to wait till next day so that I can run over to our favorite place, Harbor Freight, and I got a engine oil pressure test kit because I want to find out with an analog gauge exactly what's going on with this thing so we can narrow it down. The other thing I did go get, because this is going to be my next thing to try to rule out, is I went and got some Rotella T6. A lot of guys are recommending the 5W40, and actually Mopar is recommending that, but we live in a warm climate down here, so I don't think we're doing any harm by running the little bit thicker stuff, the 15W40, because this is all they had at the store. But I'm not too worried about this. If we had really cold temperatures, we definitely would want the 5W40, but for living in the south, 15W40 is definitely going to be okay. So we'll first start off with checking the oil pressure. If this thing reads something, then we might have a good sign. Next thing, I'm gonna probably pull the oil filter and see if there's any debris or particles in there. And then third, I think, is we'll check the oil. So first things first, let's crack this puppy open. We're gonna put it into where our oil pressure switch goes, and I'm gonna check the pressure. All right, I just checked with our spare oil pressure switch, and the threads do appear the same. So let's get to it. You guys understand what I'm doing, so I'm not gonna get in there with the camera just so I have a bit more room, but we're gonna take out the existing oil pressure switch and we're gonna put in this gauge. All right, gauge is connected and down there, and it's got a long enough hose to where we can throw it up on the dash here and see what it's reading compared to our gauge on the screen. So let's go see. All right, let's start it up. So here we go, oil pressure, got about 30 PSI. And this thing says 45 PSI. So here's where we're at currently, guys, at 8 PSI on the mechanical gauge. And the digital gauge, since, like I think I mentioned a few times in this video, the digital gauge is a calculation. It's not actually the true oil pressure. So 23 PSI on the digital gauge, and because we have the oil pressure switch disconnected, it thinks that everything is just fine and dandy. So that's the difference here. Coolant temps at 129. So we'll see it as it continues to drop. Apparently the oil pressure switch kicks in at 5 PSI. So I want to see if it gets down to that on the mechanical gauge, and then we'll continue our hunt. All right guys, well, it does appear to have pretty low oil pressure. So I think that's low enough to say that we got to go dig in for another issue. But just so you guys can see, on the dash it still says that we have 20 PSI, so don't trust the oil pressure that reads on the dash. Get yourself something mechanical where you can actually see it. So 149 degrees, coolant temp, 20 PSI. So let's shut this thing down. I want to take out the oil filter and see what's going on in there. Let's go ahead, we'll pull that oil filter, just accessible from the top here. and we can see, I don't know, we'll take the filter out and see what we see, and we'll take it to the bench. All right, guys, so I think we might be looking at an engine. I see some flakes on this right now. Yeah, I don't know if you guys can see all the metallic pieces. So there's definitely a lot of metal in this thing, you guys. So yeah, unfortunately, I think we know the fate of this thing. So yeah, there's metal chunks everywhere in this. I don't know if you guys can see all those. Pretty much metal chunks everywhere. So she is definitely going to need a new engine. Yeah, look at that one. That one's got some definite nice chunks all in it. So that is the mystery solved, boys and girls. She needs a new engine, so I guess we'll have to start looking for one. Okay, so hopefully you guys can see all those little metallic pieces. So most likely it's the bottom end failure that these things are kind of known for. Who knows what oil was in this? It doesn't look like it was dealer change oil, so could have been an issue of putting the wrong oil in it. But look at that one there. That one's brutal. See all those metal chunks in there? Sheesh. So unfortunately, she is toast, you guys. So there's no point in messing with it anymore. I gotta start looking for an engine, or maybe, I mean, you could probably obviously rebuild the engine, but in the, I guess, grand scheme of things, with us trying to be kind of time conscious and get this thing just up and running so I can drive it, I'll end up trying to find a used engine locally. Found some for about $4 grand or so, so I'm gonna see if I can shop those around, maybe price shop them a little bit more. But you guys gotta remember what I paid for this truck. So I only paid $10,700 for this thing, so I got a lot of truck for the money, and that gives us a buffer to be able to get an engine. So since we can do the engine swap, we'll probably be into this truck for, you know, under 15 grand or so, in and around that. So definitely a very nice truck to have for that price point. So like I said, I'm not upset about it. I got into this knowing what I was getting into and potentially needing an engine, but like I said, with the price we paid for it, it's not a big deal. It's just something we're gonna have to do, and more content for us. So that's the fate of it. I'm glad I didn't waste putting in that oil. But like I said, that's why I wanted to do things in these sequence, or in these steps, so that we could find out what exactly was wrong with it. So if you guys found this helpful, informative, or entertaining, make sure you give it a thumbs up before you take off. So I'm gonna go start jumping on the computer and finding that engine, so hopefully we can get this thing running within a week, because I don't want to be daily driving the Viper anymore. So that's about it, guys. Thanks for watching. See you on the next one.